Fine. So it is about the distinction between classical capitalism and modern capitalism or homoploutia. Uh, in classical capitalism, as we all know, if you read Ricardo or Marx, an implicit assumption there is that uh, all capitalists tend to be richer than workers. I have done this very simple graph. You see the income on the horizontal axis, you see number of people on the vertical axis, but the essential point is that capitalists and workers do not overlap. Or if they overlap very sort of mildly. In other words, all capitalists are richer than all workers. Very simplified version. Now, what does it also, there is another requirement there, is that basically capitalists have 100% of their income from ownership, from property, and workers have 100% of their income from working. These are two implicit assumptions that are very sort of present when you read their work, because essentially we are talking there, or they are talking rather there, about functional income distribution. So the interpersonal part really hardly makes an appearance in Marx and Ricardo because of these two assumptions. Essentially, if I know what is your source of income, I can also place you more or less in interpersonal income distribution. So different way to show that is when I rank people on the horizontal axis and I let labor income differentiation occur. So you have people who are very poor, on the vertical axis is the level of income. So you have some people who are very poor workers. They are less poor workers. They are actually relatively well-off workers, but workers end at one point where capitalists take over. And I drew capital income as an exponential function. As you see, actually, labor income sort of increases in logs as you go towards the higher percentiles, and then you have capital income, which takes off. So this is what we had in a classical capitalism. Now let's look how it is in today's capitalism. And this is also a very simplified sort of a story. But here I drew the labor income curve as I did it before. Essentially, you have people who have a low labor income, others who have mid-size, and there are those who have high labor income. Now, notice capital income. Now, I have to explain that. First, notice that now there will be some mixing. In other words, there will be some people who would have both capital and labor income. Now, for the 30% of population, generally speaking, in rich countries, they have no capital income. Their wealth is often zero, and actually in rich countries, it can be even negative. Then people start having some small capital income, but predominant source of their income is obviously labor. Then we come really at this intersection point between the blue and the red line, which basically is the top 5% of the population by income, where capital becomes the dominant source or a significant source. If not the dominant, it becomes the significant source of your income. So in other words, what this graph sort of tries to convey is that with increasing position in income distribution, your share of capital income is likely to be higher. And I think it is pretty uncontroversial thing. We find that in any household survey numbers or fiscal data, is that people who are better off, they tend to have a little bit more of capital income, and then others even more, but not only more in absolute amounts, more in a proportion. So this is the situation today. Now, how could we imagine a capitalism, I'll call it in this case homoploutic capitalism, where actually income inequality between individuals could still stay the same. So the incomes are unchanged, total incomes, but the composition is such that everybody has the same share of labor income and capital income. In other words, if you're poor, you have like 10 units of income, 7 from labor, 3 from capital. If I'm rich, I have 100 units of income, 70 from labor, 30 from capital. So what you notice there is that there is no inequality in the composition of income. And this is something that we are going to use. This is something that Marco Ranaldi in his PhD dissertation has derived as I will talk a little bit more about that, as a measurement using basically the Gini tools, Gini-like tools, as a measurement of inequality of composition. But I just want to be sure that I convey the picture correctly. You can actually have a society where inequality in composition is very high. In such a society, let's suppose capitalists are at the top and they get only income from capital. You take the entire income of the nation, just distribute them to the top people, and they have entirely their income 100% of capital, and everybody else has the income from labor. So in that condition, inequality, compositional inequality of income would reach its maximum. The other extreme is the one that I showed here, where the compositional inequality is zero. So what Marco has done is actually he is creating a sort of a Gini-like indicator, which he calls IFC, inequality on functional composition, which, like Gini, measures that inequality in your composition. And we are going to use this to measure in a minute. We are going to use this to measure real life inequality in composition between different capitalist countries or different countries, and you will see there are some interesting results there. I will not go over that. I will just let you read. This is something from the book. These are like what they call six systemic inequalities in liberal or meritocratic capitalism, which starts with increasing aggregate share of capital in national income. That's something that has been the case for the last 30 years in most countries. Then continues with very high concentration of capital ownership. In other words, capital is actually much more concentrated than labor. A subgroup there is very interesting topic of the higher return on the assets of the rich. In other words, the returns on $1 are higher if your total assets are 1 million rather than when you have 1,000. So it's actually heterogeneity in the returns to your assets, which is quite interesting because obviously it would exacerbate inequality. And then I would come to, I would now today just go straight to Homoploutia. And then there are a few other issues there like high assortative mating and the control of the political process by the rich. But let me, having said all of that, let me go to skip these previous ones and go straight to Homoploutia. So Homoploutia, I define it first as the coincidence of high capital and labor incomes received by the same people. Now, first, I will explain that even further, but let me just show you this graph, which is in the book. And that was the first actually first mention of Homoploutia, and I had even to invent the term. And when we have obviously like a new phenomenon, like all good social scientists, what do? We go back to Greek. We say, well, okay, let's invent a new term. And then I checked with my Greek friends. And when I explained to them what it is, they sort of shrug their shoulders. They say, okay, that's possible. It's not evident, but okay. Homo means obviously same. Plutia means wealth. The idea is that you have people who are rich, both in terms of human skills, so what some people call human capital, and financial capital. So they are wealthy in both human skills and financial capital. So this graph shows you that if you take the top decile of people, top decile according to wages, you find that 30%, this is the top there in 2017, that 30% of the people who are in the top decile by wages are also in the top decile by capital income. This is, of course, symmetrical. If you take 10% of the richest people who are richest by capital, you find 30% of them being richest by labor. And practically 100% of them are in the top decile by total income. So to simplify the matters, that means that 1/3 practically of the top decile of people are both in the top decile by labor and top decile by capital income. So that's what it means. Now go back to my original example with classical capitalism. What would happen in classical capitalism? You would take 10% of the richest capitalists, they are like owners of big factories, they are entrepreneurs, managers, and some of them do nothing. Maybe they're just, coupon clippers. Well, very few of them would be in the top decile by labor income. Simply, they would not have labor income. And we will see that in a minute. It's basically their share among rich laborers would be non-existent. Likewise, you take top percent of richest wage earners, relatively few of them would make it among the richest capitalists. Simply, they would not have accumulated sufficient amount of income over the ages and invested to become very rich capitalists. They might have some capital income, but unlikely to have much. What you see in the United States is the rise of that group that is both rich by capital and labor. This is the graph from the book. And as you can see, in 1980s, there was about 15% of such people in the top decile. Nowadays, they are 30%. To make sort of things even clearer, imagine the world where, and we will discuss that during the Q&A, imagine the world where 100% of the people who are in the top decile, so all of them, are also in the top decile by labor and capital. It has many implications, sociological, I think, and political, but that's something that technically could happen. And I don't think it would reach there, but as you can see, we are actually clearly increasing that percentage. Now, when you do that, I did a Luxembourgian study, data here. When you do that across countries, as you can see in this example, you find actually that most of the advanced countries are about between 20 and 30% in terms of the number of people in the top decile who are, as I was saying before, homoploutic. They are rich in both capital and labor. But notice Mexico and Brazil at the bottom of this graph with only 8%. Not surprising at all. They are still in the form of more classical capitalism, where you don't have large capitalists sort of doubling up as workers. So they are actually, it's obviously a different type of capitalism than the capitalism in more advanced countries. So then I would actually now move very briefly, I think I've got about 7 or 8 minutes, to 2 applications of homoploutia. What I've said so far is something that is in my book. But since then, I've done joint work with Marco Rinaldi, and I've done joint work with Jonathan Berman, and we have looked at these issues in greater detail. So we have looked at how much of US inequality increase is due to homoploutia, tentatively, what are the drivers of homoploutia, and then how homoploutia can help us classify and understand various capitalisms. And more speculative, I will not do it during this talk, but in the Q&A, does homoploutia imply lower social mobility, and does it make the fight against inequality more difficult? As I said, it's more speculative. This is not that we have the numbers on that. Now, this is the work with Jonathan Berman, still unpublished. What we did is get 3 data sources. I had only Luxembourg income study for the United States, which is based on current population survey, CPS. So what we did here is we took US DINA, which was, of course, as you know, done by Emmanuel Saez, Piketty, and Zuckman. We have taken also the survey of consumer finance, and we have taken least data from current population survey. So these are the 3 sources. Now, what I found originally with the data from LIS is very much corroborated here by all 3 other sources. As you can actually notice here, is that actually we have an increase in the homoploutia throughout from the 1980s onward. So that was actually the case in all the data sources. Then we also look at the top homoploutia of top 10% per capita and top percent by labor income. And then this is actually the thick black line, which shows you that increase over time. But then we also look at what happens between the people who are in top 10% by capital income and bottom 10% by labor income. And of course, here what you notice is that actually the percentage of such people declines. So in other words, remember that go back to the classical capitalism, we would actually expect that the percentage of people who are capital rich and who are labor income poor would be relatively high. But what we are seeing here is really the sort of the pendant of the two movements. One movement is the increasing thick black line showing you the rising share of people who are rich in terms of capital and labor income, and also declining share of such people who are rich in capital income that are poor in labor income. So the two things are really practically moving in a symmetrical fashion. And as I said before, what we are very much pleased by the fact that the same result of the rising homoploutia is being obtained from three different sources, which have somewhat different definitions of income and somewhat different definitions, as you know, of recipient. Then the next issue, we say, okay, how can we account, how much of total inequality can be accounted by homoploutia? This is a little bit more difficult exercise. Here is the result. First, you see that the thick line, which is the the 10% share of total income according to the DINA, US DINA calculation. So that's the thick line. Then we play the following game. We let homoploutia increase as we observe rising homoploutia by keeping the capital share fixed. Or secondly, we let the capital share increase as it did increase in real life, but keep homoploutia unchanged at its 1980 level. So what you notice here, it's kind of a little bit, perhaps not totally clear, but what you notice here is that if there is no increase in capital share, there will be a very, there would be a much lower increase in the top 10% share of total income. In other words, there will be a lower increase in inequality. If, on the other hand, there was no increase in homoploutia and capital share went up, then the increase actually would be much less. So the bottom line is that we find that 1/5 of the increase in inequality measured by the top decile share is due to homoploutia. And the homoploutia plays a bigger role than simply the increase in capital share. So we were basically here contrasting the increase in homoploutia versus the increase in capital share. We also speculate, because I don't show you that here, but we speculate because of some of the results that we find that homoploutia was essentially driven by the widening of wage distribution. In other words, from the 1980s, wage distribution became much wider, so that the Gini and the top decile share of wages increased, and that enabled very high labor incomes, which over a certain period of time enabled people who receive them to save sufficient amount of money and to invest and to become also capital rich. So this is somewhat more speculative because we simply base that on the fact that the correlation between the movement in the wage stretching and homoploutia is very strong. So it cannot be really proven, I believe, but it can be sort of, it is a coincidental movement and there is a certain logic behind that, but obviously it remains to be seen if that interpretation is correct. And I will now finish my half an hour by going to just showing you the work with Marco Ranaldi, which is different in the sense that now we look at structure of incomes or homoploutia across countries. The work obviously with Jonathan was about the United States over the last 30 years. Now, this is actually what we find here is on the horizontal axis is IFC, which is the measure of inequality, or compositional inequality that I defined before, that Marco has created in his PhD dissertation, and on the vertical axis is the Gini coefficient. So start with people at the very top here. If you can see them, I cannot, well, at the very top when you see Guatemala, Brazil, India, Paraguay, Panama, Mexico, Chile, these are the countries which have very high Gini coefficient. You see it's a Gini coefficient about 55, so that's something that we knew, but also very high IFC, which means the very high inequality in composition. In other words, capitalists have mostly capital income, no labor income, workers have mostly labor income. We treat, by the way, self-employment as entirely labor income. That's one issue, the definitional issue. I will not talk about it right now, but definitely ask me questions about this later. Then look at this major part in the middle, where you have Great Britain, Australia, Canada, Ireland, Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, Switzerland, Sweden, and so on. So what these countries have show moderate inequality. You see the Gini are about 0.4. These are, by the way, obviously only factor income Gini, so it doesn't include the redistribution, and also moderate level of compositional inequality. But the interesting group is here, this group, which is a small one, which is in the southeastern corner, and which includes some East European countries like Poland, but includes, and Czech Republic, but includes quite a few of Nordic countries like Iceland, Denmark, Norway. And what was interesting there is that these are societies that are fairly class-based in that sense, because there is a certain, there is a fairly high inequality in the composition of their incomes, but they have low interpersonal inequality. And that's the most interesting, my last slide will be, I'll skip one or two, but let me just show you the Nordic countries. This is the most interesting result because it implies that you can have fairly class-based societies where actually the compositional inequality is very high. You know, some people just have high share of their income from capital and many others only have from labor, but you can have low inequality, interpersonal inequality, brought about by essentially wage compression. So this is our argument for Nordic countries. So you see now I've simply here shown the same results that I've had on this, graph with liberal capitalism, which would be continental Europe, Canada, Australia, with Nordic and Central European countries with high compositional inequality, but with low interpersonal inequality, classical capitalism of Latin America and India with both high compositional inequality and interpersonal inequality, and hypothetical situation, and this is the end, hypothetical situation of Homoploutia, where you could actually have low compositional inequality. Let's suppose that everybody has the same shares of capital and labor income, and yet your interpersonal inequality could be high. So you could actually have such hypothetical societies that are really at the other extreme of sort of Marxist societies that are divided and stratified between capital and labor. Here you would not have stratification. Everybody would be equally percentage-wise worker and capitalist, but their incomes would be vastly different and the inequality could be high. So obviously that's a hypothetical society. We don't find, actually, ironically, China comes closest to that society, but we obviously don't find, not obviously, but so far we have not found any that would really fit that particular group. So I think I will stop here. I think there are quite a lot of issues to be discussed, including, as I mentioned, definitions, what is capital, what is labor, how do we distinguish between them. There is also an issue that I simply want to mention, I will not discuss it, is that when you introduce and divide pensions between pensions that are private and public and treat private pensions as capital income, the position of the Nordic countries changes. In other words, they move towards less lower IFC inequality, because then pensioners become partly capitalists. So it is also a very interesting situation of what we call in a last part of the paper, kind of a pensioner capitalism. In other words, you then have really more equal distribution of capital income, but it's really interesting, it's really among the pensioners that it is being introduced and changes somewhat the image of the class-based Nordic societies. So let me stop here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would be, of course, very happy to have a discussion, and I would take notes because this is work in progress, and your comments would be very welcome directly, or you can obviously send me email.
All right. Great. Thanks, Branko. That was extremely clear. I see that there are in the chat a number of questions already. I had some too. Perhaps I can. Tom, do you want to go first, Tom de Hert? If you can unmute yourself, obviously. I don't hear Tom.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes,
Hello.
yes, okay.
Good evening. Yes, I had some questions indeed about the data. And especially, of course, capital is evolving over time in a different way. It has its internal dynamics compared to salaries or to wage income. But more specifically, if we make these international comparisons, the paper you wrote with Rinaldi, so we are working with country averages. So I suppose there are some evolutions behind this, but more particularly, how did the financial crisis of 2008 affect this? Did it increase or did it decrease the path you seem to suggest towards homoploutia?
Okay.
Can I combine with another question?
Yes, yes, please do.
Yes, these international comparisons. So yeah, a crucial thing, I suppose, is the measure of the measures of capital and labor, but especially capital income. I suppose there are some measurement problems there, and perhaps these measurement problems are biased also, and they are the bias is related to GNI per capita. So which might have some implications on the trends you observe if you're comparing different countries, well, with different with over a range of income.
Eve, do you want me to reply very quickly?
Go ahead, Branko. That makes it.
I would be quick so that we have a chance to all speak. First point, I think it's a very good point. We had actually, by the way, very similar comments even from the referees. They would like to see time dimension. I really cannot tell you. I really don't know actually how between the different countries have been affected by the financial crisis. You know, we have at least my preference was really to average these things by countries because we really wanted to do a kind of varieties of capitalism stuff, not so much how things have changed over the relatively short run and how the crisis has affected. But we will have to do that. But to give you an answer, I don't know how it has actually affected different countries. We will have to do that work. And for the capital labor measurement, it's a very good question. That's a significant issue. I mentioned self-employment income. That's particularly important because the question is actually, do we take self-employment income and try somewhat arbitrarily to divide it between labor and capital? And some people have done, as you know, 2/3 for labor, 1/3 for capital, which is arbitrary, and then which would have to apply to everybody, starting from Peru up to UK. So that we thought was a little bit over the top because you know, these are very different countries, and self-employment income may be actually the share of self-employment income, which is due to capital, may be very different. So we have decided to go ahead with treating self-employment income as entirely as labor income. mostly because we have this broad picture of the world, and in Latin American countries, self-employment income is fairly significant, and most of that is actually income of people who are in the lower part of income distribution, where really the capital share must be, and we have some studies that show that is very small. So if you're really going out in the street and selling trinkets, the capital share is really small. But that's an issue of classification. Another issue is, how do you treat pensions? We treated pensions as deferred labor income. That was our first definition. And the second definition was we broke down, to the extent that we had that information, we broke down the pensions into public and private, and private into the funded private pensions, and then funded private pensions become capital income. So that's something that I already alluded to before with regard to the Nordic countries. So these were some of the issues that we had with the definitions of the. Finally, capital income definition is pretty straightforward. It is, interest, dividends, and rents. It doesn't include capital gains.
All right, thanks. Tom, do you want to come back, or do I give the floor to someone else?
Yeah, you can give the floor to someone else. I can come back later as well.
Okay, great. Because I think Bas van Bavelen saw that you had a bit of a related question. Bas, if you want to come in.
Thanks a lot. And thanks a lot, Branko, for your talk and making us think hard again. So my question was along similar lines about the definition. So in the Netherlands, the self-employed, who are now 1/3 of the income of the households, the new self-employed, their income was assigned to capital up to a few years ago, as it was decided to split it and divide it half and half over capital and labor income, which I think has a huge effect on outcomes, on results. But now, because you already answered this and tackled this, so I wanted to ask you something else. So you started out with the meritocratic ideal. And I think the split between capital income and labor income might be very important for this ideal. And if people with higher incomes also derive a part of their income from labor, does this then legitimize their income more than it would do if it would be only income from capital? And so what does this mean for their political viewpoints and the possibility to change or to address income inequalities?
Well, thank you very much, Bas. It's a great question. On the first one, I have to say that I believe that in future work, which will be done also by other people, because I do think that this idea of homoploutia is picking up. I see from the interest of people. This split between capital and labor or self-employment income really has to be taken seriously, and probably within countries, because with in the US, as you know, it was also the same problem. People like to treat lots of that as capital income because the taxation on capital income is paradoxically lower than on labor income.
Right.
So, when you look at the fiscal data, it's actually treated as capital income. Economists prefer to actually have some kind of a split. And then, as you said, for the Netherlands, the split itself has changed. So I think it's a big issue, and particularly since the percentage of these people are increasing, I think it might really come with different results. On the second point, I totally agree with you. I have nothing really to add to that. I really believe that homoploutia has, in my opinion, has two sociological implications. One, homoploutia combined with assortative mating makes such families, first, totally resistant, not totally, but much more resistant to any change. If the stock market goes down, they have large labor income. If unemployment goes up, they have large capital income. So they're really quite resistant to fluctuations in the economic activity. Plus, they are able to convey a number of advantages to their children from, of course, having saved lots of money and also from investing in education and all the other connections that come with it. So I think there is really a sort of an issue between homoploutia and lower social mobility. And that, of course, goes to the issue that Bas mentioned, and I simply can repeat what he said. It is that social acceptability of high taxation of people who actually have a significant part of their income from labor. And moreover, when we observe them, we really don't know how much they have. What we notice is that they are working, many of them, as you know, 70 hours a week. We actually have these studies that people at the top work much more than people in the middle. And then you say, well, he is rich, but I don't know that whether he gets 50% from capital or not. What I observe is that he is hardworking and that he is having a large income from labor. So I think it actually socially validates, legitimizes these incomes much more than if you see, like when I read Stefan Zweig's The World of Yesterday, and also in Keynes in the beginning of the famous The Economic Consequences of the Peace, when he basically says, well, capitalists, many of them were just investors. They do nothing. They just, cut coupons and get money. So that's not socially sort of, so acceptable. So that's totally agree with you. It's actually something that we have to think.
Okay. Bas, are you happy?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Branko.
Yeah, and thanks, Branko, because I wanted to ask you exactly that. I mean, you addressed it, what the implications are, how it is different, because of course, we know a lot about income inequality and wealth inequality separately, but how this has specific implications, and you addressed that. So thanks for that. There was a question from Sam van der Kerkhoven. Sam, your question was more or less addressed, but perhaps you want to take the floor.
No, it's fine for me, but perhaps if you get off the shot.
Sam, you're hardly understandable. There must be something with your mic. Sam, do you hear me?
I can see Sam, but...
Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Better now? Okay, no, perhaps a clearer picture of what such a Homoplutian looks like. What kind of jobs are they doing? And what kind of additional income from which sectors, for instance, do they primarily have?
Excellent question. I have to say, I don't know. It's something we have not studied. I think it's really for the next, not generational studies, but really for the follow-up studies. But it's an excellent question. It has been also raised by one of the referees. We really don't know. But it would be interesting to see, are they really in the financial sector? Are they the IT sector? Are there people who are in the old-fashioned liberal professions? I was also thinking, but this is something that people like Bas and others who actually work in more economic history, I was wondering, could we go really back even in the, I don't see the data exactly, but could we really start to make some assumptions going back into the early 20th century, breaking this down and looking at whether we had whether this division between capitalists and workers that I explained in the beginning, which is based on sort of assumptions, it's not really empirical. Can we really do something about that as well? So anyway, so these are really sort of historical parts, but to answer your question, unfortunately, I don't know. And I think that really needs to be studied much more in the next papers.
Okay, thanks. Henry Hapanala, you're the next one up.
Good, thank you. I hope that my mic works.
It does.
Good, excellent. Yeah, I think my question was, you kind of referred to it already, and it kind of relates to the questions about who these people are who are homoploutic. So I was wondering whether income tax plays a role, or income tax progressivity. I bet especially in the Nordic countries, there is a very real case of, for example, CEOs who are not willing to pay themselves salaries, but who are instead paid in stocks and dividends, precisely because the capital gains tax is so much lower than the top end income tax. So I do wonder what you have to say about income tax progression.
I have to say about the definitions that we are taking a fairly standard definition. For example, if your let's suppose you're a CEO or somebody, and your wage is made a function, or for example, you're the wealth manager, and your wage is made a function of the how successful you're managing that wealth, it is still labor income. And that's how it is actually in survey. It is considered labor income, despite the fact that there is a connection between your labor income and the returns that you have realized. However, when you are paid in stocks, that of course is the increase in your wealth. It's not part of your income, and the return that you get from that stock is capital income. So I think that we are reasonably clear on this, and this is something that has been used before. So, you know, if you are paid in stocks, yes, when you get the return from that stock, it is part of your capital income. But if I link, for example, your compensation to whether you have performed very well as a wealth manager, then it is labor income.
Good. Tim, goedemiddag.
Like carried interest, for example.
Hi, thanks so much for this very stimulating presentation. I've got a question about the nature of the measure of compositional inequality that you use. And so I wonder how robust this is to different specifications. As I understand, if I've understood it correctly, now it's a relative measure. So right. If the maximum share of capital in income would be 5% and the minimum share would be 0.1%, it would be way higher than if it would vary between 70% and 30%, for instance. So that's one question. And the other question is how this relates to the distribution of capital itself. So you can imagine that capital is perfectly equally distributed across the distribution of total income or labor income. And still your measure of compositional inequality can be higher than in the case of a very unequal distribution of capital income. But obviously the nature of capitalism is then very different. So this is more, I mean, this relates more to a conceptual question, I think, about your indicator of compositional inequality.
Tim, let me say that the first one, I understood the question because yes, indeed, the question is actually if the capital share is like 0.5% or capital share is 50%, the measure is relative. It would be, however, different because it is the maximum measure is obtained when you take whatever is the amount of capital income, divide it equally among the sort of necessary number of people that actually can receive it. So, and 100% receive it, I mean, having 100% share. So it would be, it would be reflected, the size of the capital share in the economy would be reflected in the measure. The second question, I didn't understand exactly. So do you mind actually repeating it or maybe explaining it to me better?
Yeah, I think it's very much related to this previous, to the thing you just mentioned. So if I understand it correctly, your compositional inequality would be highest if capital would be distributed equally across the distribution of labor income? Is that what
No, the compositional equality, compositional inequality would be 0 if everybody had the same share. So you and I and everybody else had, so it's 0 inequality.
Exactly, yes.
The maximum inequality is when I take the amount of capital which exists in a society and I divide that capital by giving to people with observed income. So if I observe the richest guy having $100 of income, my counterfactual on which I calculated the measure is I give 100 units of capital income to him. The second highest guy, I give him 90. So you see, I'm giving that capital only to the people at the top. And then I calculate the inequality measure, the IFC, inequality of functional composition.
Yes, so if I understand it correctly, then this implies that there's a peculiar relation between this compositional inequality measure and measures of inequality in capital itself. So you
Yes.
might have a situation where capital is
Yes.
equally distributed among the population, but you may still have a relatively high compositional inequality. And so that has very different implications about how we characterize capitalism, for instance. So I think that's more a conceptual question about,
I understand your point. I think it's actually, I cannot exactly answer it, but I understand basically what you're saying. There is a difference between the IFC measure that I just talked about and concentration coefficient of capital, or the Gini coefficient of capital. But I think it's better to speak of the concentration coefficient of capital, because the ranking is according to income. And then you look at actually what is yes, there is, I think that actually, I don't know if Marco has derived that in his dissertation, but yes, I think these are two different measures. I would see them, I mean, it seems to me that they are correlated, but I have actually to ask Marco about that, because it's really, I mean, as I said, he developed the tools. But it's a good question. I see these are obviously two different ways of looking at it.
Okay, thanks. Bruno Blondet. Bruno, we can't hear you. No. Try again.
Yeah, I can see Bruno, but no, I cannot hear him.
No. Bruno, is okay if I move on, perhaps, and then you figure out perhaps how to to get yourself unmuted. There's someone who identifies himself or herself as junior, and who has a kind of interesting question about developing countries, but I'm not sure who junior might be. So junior, stand up, please, and unmute yourself. I hear some sound.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
do.
Yeah, I was intentful when you are talking about the question of today, and your examples and your demonstrations was specifically about developed country like USA and China. And I would like to hear something from you about this question in a developing country. What about the trend of, I don't really have the words, I don't really have the words, but what is the trend of this question in undeveloped country like sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah. Okay, this is obviously a good question. Okay, first of all, we do have, as you can see here, quite a few countries, well, actually lots of countries from Latin America, and I already talked about them. They're in that circle that you can see in the northeastern circle with high inequality and high compositional, high interpersonal and high compositional inequality. Some of them are in the middle, as you can see. Dominican Republic, Colombia, Peru are actually countries with lower compositional inequality. We have also countries in Asia, for example, India, which really displays many features which make India look like a Latin American country. This is something that in my recent work, I've really become more and more convinced that India has features that are de facto very, very close to Latin American countries in terms of both class composition of income and interpersonal inequality. But when it comes to countries in Africa, we have really like the typical situation is really the data problem. We don't have, I think from Lee's perspective, we have only Cote d'Ivoire, I believe. We have South Africa. So we have relatively few countries. I think South Africa should be somewhere around here, but I just don't see it now. Because it has very high interpersonal inequality and it probably has also high compositional inequality. So here we really have a problem of data, but on top of that, to go back to the questions that was asked before, we do have also a problem of allocation of self-employment income, because self-employment income is high in those societies. And finally, when I mentioned the problem of data, many of the African countries, most of African countries have data on consumption. Now that obviously is not useful for us. We need data on income. So I'm unfortunately don't think that we would have soon much to say about most of sub-Saharan Africa.
All right, thank you. I think I'll pass the floor to your compatriot, Sunčića Vujić.
I don't see. Let me see.
I can see. I can see her.
Good evening. Good evening, Branko. Dobro
Good
večer.
evening.
Very interesting. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can. Yes.
Very interesting talk. So I would just go back to Sam's question, and I don't know if you go further in this direction. Who are the Homoploutians? I would really be interested in some gender aspects, and also now with COVID, since it is clear that certain occupations are more affected than the others, and for example, our jobs can go ahead unaffected, whereas some other jobs are completely at a standstill. So if you have any research that you have already done, or if you're going to go further into the types of who are the Homoploutians, to look into these aspects of occupation and occupation by gender, particularly if let's say the labor force participation rates are very different by men and women.
It's an excellent question. As I said before, we have not done that at all. It is still relatively recent, kind of idea. It was first published like in 2019 in September. So we had these two papers. I think there is quite a lot of interest. Now, first, who are they? As I said before, I think it's eminently feasible to do, because what you have in surveys, you have, of course, first you define, find who are Homoploutians, and then you have, of course, there in most surveys, you have their labor force status and the source of their labor income, so the occupation. So I think it's actually eminently doable, and I think it's super interesting, especially to look whether they are people who are mostly connected to the financial sector, or they're connected to the sort of rising IT sectors, or are they really more old-fashioned liberal occupations? So I think it can be done. You can certainly do that, and others. So I think it's a whole new area. On COVID, obviously that can be done as well, but I have to say that my general perception or perspective now is that we are really dealing here with longer term movements. And that's why I was not even so much keen on time-wise change. I mean, I'm interested in a longer term evolution. And I think this is a longer term evolution of capitalism toward creation of that self-sustaining upper class that is actually both rich in capital and labor, that is able to transfer its advantages to children, that is actually intermarrying. And these are, I think, longer term processes than the COVID. I mean, on the assumption, obviously, that we see an end to COVID. If it keeps on going for 10 years, then, yes, it will become a long-term issue. But anyway, this is my own perspective. Obviously, people can, disagree with that and do it anyway. But I think for the first question, yes, I think it's actually a very nice research project.
Thank you.
Okay. Bruno, I will try and give you the floor again, and if it doesn't work, I'll read out the question. It should work. No, we don't hear you, unfortunately. Sorry, very sorry about that. I'll read out your question, okay? I'll do it in a Bruno Blondet way if I can. Okay, Branko, if Homoploutia becomes a systemic force as you describe it with your forecasting, then be other things equal, that the phenomenon cannot but accelerate income inequality in the coming years, say the next 10 years.
Yes, I actually think it's super interesting in the sense that if you look at this kind of how should I say, from the perspective of the past. You can say, look, Homoploutia is a great development. Capitalism has overcome that segmentation and that split between capital owners and laborers. And I mean, if you really were to push this further, and when we all end up with having a little bit of capital income. But the problem could be still at the top for the reasons that, you know, Bas, when he asked, when we discussed that, and now when Bruno asks, we could actually really deal with a very powerful, in the sense of being self-sustainable and being able to reproduce itself, a class that is really sort of winning in all different respects. Winning by having more labor income, more capital income, transferring disadvantages to children and so forth. So, you know, it is somewhat, how should I say, paradoxical, because on one hand, it is a good development that we don't have this huge segmentation between capital owners and workers. On the other hand, it might make actually dealing with high inequality more difficult.
All right, good. Joachim, it's a short question, but I'll you can ask it yourself.
Yeah. Well, the short version of the question is what you think about this is sort of on the wider research agenda of inequality, and I was wondering what you thought about the reduction of inequality being a part of the SDGs. And specifically, if you contrast it, for example, to something like poverty or child mortality or hunger, we know that all of these things, we don't want them around. We don't want any poor people. We don't want children dying. We don't want any people going hungry. But what's the goal with inequality? It's probably not zero inequality. And if we don't want to put it at zero, it becomes sort of a very abstract thing. So what should we put in the SDGs that's sort of operational and politically achievable, that could be a goal for inequality? So, or if you look through your data set, because you look at inequality numbers all the time, when do you say like, this is a good level of inequality?
You know, first on SDG, I have to say I've been contacted, it was, I don't know how many years ago, 5 years ago, something. I mean, for somebody who is working on inequality, I was always very skeptical about introducing that in the in SDGs. And of course they introduced it now with, you know, like 5 different types and versions or whatever. I think the problem with introducing inequality is an amorphous concept. You know, first, it doesn't have a number that is desirable per se. You know, we can say, you know, let's look at, you know, rich West European countries that are actually countries with moderate inequality. So we can say that that's kind of heuristically a good Gini coefficient, but there is nothing behind that other than my eyeing these numbers and saying, well, they are actually rich and they seem to have a good growth rate, and they can do that with relatively moderate inequality. And think actually in the global context, it makes even less sense. You know, maybe that number at all is not good for China. You know, and I think to a large extent, I would see Chinese increase in inequality to follow really Kuznets type of rising inequality due to industrialization, urbanization. And then in the last 15 years, China has been essentially at very high plateau of inequality. So to what an extent then is a Belgian inequality relevant for China? Should China also have a Gini of 34? You know, I don't think so. So I was very skeptical. To be quite honest, I would be actually, frankly, I would not have an inequality objective of that kind in SDRs. I can see some arguments for having an objective in sort of zero. I mean, between gender inequality, of racial inequality or something that's measurable, and the zero is an objective, but not really for other things. I just don't see what is the number, and I did not participate, and I don't even know exactly what are all these objectives.
Happy, Joachim? Clear reply. What? Yeah. Okay, he's happy. Good. There's someone in the chat identified as C5 or CRS. I'm not sure whether anyone recognizes that name. Wait for a moment. The question, yes, I hear some noise. Please go ahead.
See if I can. Hi, Branko. This is
Oh,
David.
hi, Sharon. How are you?
Fine, about you? I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Yes, fine.
Great. My question is that I think this is a very interesting project, and I think you did a great job. I would be especially interested in the next slide that you omitted, actually, about associative mating, which might explain a lot. But my question is that what do you think that the consequences might be of your research for the political parties, the selection of the voters' preferences that we observe in Europe? What's going on is that voters are being increasingly disappointed and discouraged with what the mainstream parties offer, and they are going for what might be once labeled as fringe parties, and now they are coming to the center. And I'm thinking that your research have actually a direct relevance for what we observe in the political scene. Any opinions on that? And thank you.
Well, Shanes, before I give you my opinion, but I am not, tell me what would be, I would be very happy that if the research has the direct implication, but I suppose the only way that I can see it right now, because I haven't thought of that before, is that the implication is also that people who are at the bottom, I'm sorry, that they are actually poor both in capital and labor. But is there something more? Because you said it has direct implication, but I couldn't see it exactly. So maybe you can explain that a little bit better.
My question would be that if people who are being left behind are feeling a little bit increasingly insecure, practically because I mean basically they have their income sources are getting squeezed out in this Homoploutia capitalism, as you described.
No, I see now, and it's actually good that I wanted really to put also this slide from assortative mating. That's also from my book, because I think that these two things go together to explain the dynamic of class reproduction, if you will. Because if you have homoploutia, as I was saying before, and on top of that, excuse me, you have assortative mating. And then on top of that, you have ability to influence the political process through donation and through influence of the political parties. Then you really have a sort of very strong ability to have legislation which is in your favor and ability to transfer these advantages across generations. So I see homoploutia, assortative mating, control of the political process, and very high cost of private education, which really works as a monopoly control. In other words, if only rich people are able to send children to the schools from which after they graduate, they get higher wages, then you really have a very, very well created system for maintaining these advantages. And so I can see now Shemin's question as saying, if that system is so kind of impregnable and it's done so well, and in a book by Daniel Markovich, which I would really very strongly recommend, it's called The Meritocracy Trap, he speaks precisely about that class, which is not the top 1% only, it's top 10% or maybe more, that is hardworking, has all these characteristics which I mentioned, and is very, how should I say, has very traditionalist values, social values. In other words, we are not talking here about the aristocracy that is going to squander that money on good parties and have, bring people around and have them drink lots of wine and champagne. This is a much more, according in his view, much more sort of rigid, socially conservative group. And hence, it's a much more difficult to be disentrenched, precisely because their decisions are very clever from the point of view of their own maintenance in power. That, of course, implies for those others, 90% who are not there, and certainly for those at the bottom, that they have no chance to get to the top. And I think that's what I see as Shevrin's question. I cannot say that I've done anything with that, other than in the book I describe what I just said about self-sustaining upper class.
Branko, if I may just push you on that for a moment, do you see that? I mean, that is a very speculative question, obviously, but do you see that as a kind of perpetually self-reinforcing mechanism, or will it reach some breaking point at some point?
I don't know, but I think this self-reproduction, I think it's very important. And for me, and this is not my area, so you guys, many of you know that much better. I was very impressed by the functioning of the American private education system. I really, as I say this in the book, I really see it as essentially a monopoly. In other words, you have actually an incentive to make it even more expensive, because by making it very, very expensive, you are eliminating competition for your children that might come from the rest of the society. I mean, if I make it not 50,000, if I make it, now you see like graduate studies are 50,000 per year. If I make it 100,000, I'm going to have even smaller pool. And I think that really plays a big role in this reproduction, particularly since graduating is sending a signal that you are really very smart. And I was, or at least knowledgeable. I was actually also impressed by the very fact, which I think is really worthwhile thinking. To many people, I said to my students, I come from a country where you bribe professors to get a good grade. But in the US, you don't need to do that, because the issue is not the professor. In the US, the bottleneck is admissions. And that's why we had the scandals in the US about admission. So you're basically bribing the admission officers, because once you're there, you have graduated. If you look at these numbers, it's 99% of people who graduate. Only those who leave don't graduate, but everybody else graduates. So as I said, I think it's wrong when people say he graduated from Harvard. That's irrelevant. They should say he was admitted.
You got it, yeah.
Yeah. So, I think that the educational part that Marković writes a lot is extremely important in that class reproduction.
Right. Good. I guess, Tom, you still had a question, and perhaps that perhaps will be the last one, because I think it's kind of time to start rounding off. Tom.
Yes. Yeah, well, we have had a lot of great questions. I don't know whether my question is still relevant, but
the one on Galbraith, huh?
Yeah, it's one on yeah. So you suggested at some point that the homoploutia in the US is driven by increasing range in wages, huh?
Yes.
Wage income in the US. So this made me think of James Galbraith's work and his argument that wage income inequality relates to changes in antitrust policy in the US. He saw that income inequality rising from the mid-70s, 80s onwards. Can you comment on that? So this means that the very richest accumulating capital, these are the CEOs of new companies. And
yeah, I think actually that's going back also to the question that was raised: who are these people who are homoploutic? And I think that's really an interesting question. I remember, since you mentioned Jamie Galbraith, I remember, for example, in his book of some years ago, when he decomposed the increase in US income inequality geographically, he found that there are, I think, like out of 3,300 counties in the US, if you take 8 or 10 of them, they explain half of the increase in inequality. And these 8 of them were counties where you actually had IT industry, which were basically Seattle, San Jose, and San Francisco area. And then you had New York for the financial sector. And interestingly, Jamie also put Washington as because it is true, Washington, several counties around Washington are very rich. And that was basically through government lobbying and things of that nature. So yes, it's actually, I think, quite, I found that quite intriguing and very interesting. Before we conclude, let me, if I may just say, this graph that I put here is the companion graph to Homoploutia, which is this assortative mating, which shows you from the 1970s to 2017, the percentage of the cohorts of males age, as you can see, 20 to 35, who are marrying women from the top wage group or the bottom wage group. In the very beginning, the percentages are the same. So the likelihood of them marrying, they're actually in the top wage decile for men, but they are equally likely to marry women from the bottom of women's decile, bottom decile, and the top. Well, now by the end of the period, the ratio is 3 to 1. So actually, they are actually 3 times as likely to marry women from the top wage decile as for the bottom. And for women, because they're not going, sort of falling behind men, in their case, the ratio is 5 to 1. So clearly, we have had much more of a mating of people with similar incomes and similar educations than in the past.
All right, thanks, Branko. Unless there are, I'm looking quickly again at the chat, but I think then it is time to bring this to a close because our attention spans are limited anyway on Zoom. I think this is like the optimal kind of time span to keep some level of concentration. And by the way, my apologies to all those people whose names I mispronounced. Okay, Branko, thank you so much for being with us. And to everybody, thank you for being here, and we'll keep you posted on further April events. So
Please.
See you next time.
Thank you to everybody. I mean, very nice to see many of the faces that I would wish to see you in person. And I hope we will be able to do that hopefully this year or next. And thanks again for the invitation. Obviously, I will send you the slides if you want to use the slides.
Yes, please.